Okay, so we're in terms of item 5 in the open agenda on page 7. It's the confirmation of minutes from our 9 March meeting. If I can move in seconder for that, please. Okay, Chair Pamela, seconder. Yeah, Adrian. There's nothing, no questions or clarifications. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. And then we'll move on to the next item, and that's the receipt of the minutes from the first meeting of the Future Proof Public Transport Subcommittee. Don't know, Robert or Mark, did you wish to make any comment on those minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Mark Tamura from Waikato Regional Council, Director, Regional Transport Connections. We're just bringing this to your attention probably two reasons. One is that this was the first meeting of the Public Transport Subcommittee, which is constituted under the Future Proof Partnership. This is a really important committee in that it provides at a governance level, a political governance level, the ability for us to give effect to some of the kaupapa that we've just heard before in relation to the coordination of investment across services, infrastructure, and across the Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program within the Future Proof sub-region. So it was a key element of what Waka Kotahi and all of us saw as a really important backbone to enabling us to deliver on the Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program. It is now established, it has had its first meeting. There were 2 items of business on that agenda. One was the endorsement and recommendation through primarily to the Waikato Regional Council as the principal for Te Huia of an addendum to the Te Huia single stage business case. That was the original business case that saw Te Huia started. That's a really important piece of work. It's rather technical in nature, but what it does is it clarifies how Te Huia will operate, or will be able to operate, subject to funding, post the opening of Auckland City Rail Link. The Auckland Rail network gets very busy. Frequencies on that network approximately double. There was understandably some concern about the ability of Te Huia to operate within that environment. What this business case does is it is a technical investigation that confirmed the ability for Te Huia to operate up to half hourly. Now that's a long way ahead of where we think Te Huia might get in the near term, but it effectively confirms the ability of Te Huia to operate within the Auckland network. It also confirms a preferred endpoint to that service, which is the current endpoint of the service, the Strand, which is excellent for our customers. We've seen how they responded to a shift in the endpoint of that service, or the start point if you're in Auckland to the service, being through to the Strand, providing that direct connection. It also shone a light on future rolling stock requirements, a very high level assessment of that, but did provide some useful information through that work. And also some potential service levels that might be, that will help us inform what service levels may be, providing us a baseline for budgeting after the introduction, after the start of the City Rail Link. So that was one of the items. As the principal for that service, that item's being coming through to the Waikato Regional Council at their next meeting as well. The other item of note there was an update report on the Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program business case, and much of that kaupapa was covered in some earlier conversation at this meeting, so I won't recap that. But those were the 2 items, Mr. Chair. Happy to take any questions in relation to them.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So I'll just open it up for any questions of Mark in terms of what he's outlined and the nature of that subcommittee meeting. No, there don't appear to be any.
Yes.
Sarah.
Thanks, Chair Bill. Mark, I was just wondering, I did ask you a little bit earlier this week, but I thought maybe it might be useful for a wider discussion, just the current thinking around the next steps for the delivery of public transport. And we've had the business improvement review happen and some options considered. Yeah, where do you see that potentially going next?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. The Public Transport Business Improvement Review was a piece of work that the Waikato Regional Council commissioned in 2021, delivered in 2022, which really stepped back to have a look at how we fund and deliver public transport services in the Waikato region, the mechanics, the institutional arrangements around that. The Regional Council then subsequently endorsed an implementation strategy around that had a few components to it, and the Regional Council was continued through the change through the trienniums to the next stages of implementing those. Among those are probably two key planks at the moment. One is in relation to the funding model. We have a mixed funding model at the moment where for some local authorities the Regional Council rates directly. There are other territorial authorities, including Waipa and Waikato District Councils, where those councils rate for services pass the funding through to the Regional Council on the basis of which we commission services. So that was one component, kind of bringing a more orderly and consistent approach to that. And the other component was to explore what the first steps to a sub-regional public transport authority may look like that would enable us to more formally coordinate public transport service and public transport infrastructure delivery within the future-proof sub-region. The work that was undertaken there provided a bit of a decision-making pathway for that, which really tested the willingness of those people that would need to come on that journey together. A series of questions about the level of divestment of authority and control to some extent over those components that would need to take place. Now, the very first step in that, referring back to my earlier discussion, was actually the establishment of a joint committee. And so I think we have made the first step on that journey. The question that I think is really being asked is, what are the next steps on that journey beyond that? It effectively remains an open question for the partnership, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Jackie.
Yeah, thank you. I may have missed it, so I apologise for that. Couple of questions for the chair. The Tahuia opening is after the opening of the City Rail Link. The preferred option of the opening of operating of the Tahuia after the opening of the City Rail Link. So what does that mean in terms of when and how?
Well, the opening of the City Rail Link is not something I'm taking bets on. We expect it will be in 2026. It may be, I can only go by what's been publicly announced there, but what this is, so when the City Rail Link in Auckland opens, it will enable Auckland Metro services to enter and exit the CBD of Auckland via a loop rather than straight in and out. And that enables them to significantly increase the frequency of services on that Auckland network. Te Huia operates on the same sets of tracks that the Metro network operates on. And with that significant increase in service frequency, we needed assurance that Te Huia was going to be able to operate within that far busier network. So that's really what it means. The questions that had to be answered was really that primary one: would Te Huia be able to operate through into the Auckland network within that much busier environment? And the answer was yes.
And last question is, okay, so passenger rail out of the future proof, out of Hamilton, Auckland, what's the scenario for, I guess, is there a link for passenger rail for NZ Inc? Like a strategy, commitment, plan, investment? Anything?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. There have been some signals sent by government about wider pieces of work in rail in general. Some of them would significantly would enable us to consider many more options when it comes to passenger rail. One of those really important pieces of work is the government funding through Budget 2023 of an electrification business case for the gaps in the Upper North Island through to Tauranga and between Hamilton and Auckland. And were that to be the case, that has a very big bearing on the nature of rolling stock that might in time replace Te Huia, because it would potentially have access to lines. It may also significantly change the proposition with respect to passenger rail between Tauranga and Hamilton, because a key constraint at the moment is the Kaimai Tunnel, through which a diesel passenger train can't go.
Okay.
So it does start to really change that conversation. I think the Waikato Regional Council, and I know others who made submissions to the Select Committee inquiry into passenger rail, have called for a government strategy, in effect, I'm paraphrasing there, to paint a bit more of a directional picture around the future of passenger rail, because you know, that inquiry itself lent on a couple of pieces of work that have been done by the community and ground up, which some of you may be familiar with, driven from a community group over in the Western Bay of Plenty, and also a consortium of North Island district and regional councils.
It'd be nice if there was a bipartisan agreement for the long term. Thank you.
There's nothing further, but thanks very much, Mark, in taking us through what's happening in that space. So if I can have a mover and seconder to receive those subcommittee minutes, I've got
Happy to.
Angela and Mayor Jackie. Nothing further, I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So we'll now move to item 7 and the Implementation Advisor update and report. And just noting that it is Robert's first report as the confirmed implementation advisor. So I just wanted to note that and hand over to you, Robert, in terms of any matters you want to highlight. And just before you do that, I just need to, so everyone's clear, and on page 25 of Robert's report, item 6 talks about the Smart Growth Leadership Transport Resolutions. I just wanted to put it on the table that I'm a member of the Smart Growth Leadership Group that's promoted those resolutions. So not declaring a conflict per se, but I just wanted all the members to appreciate that situation. Robert.
Cool. So I won't dwell on the detail of my report other than to highlight some changes or things that have happened since this report was written. So first off, I can confirm in terms of the communications advisor that we've appointed Natalie Haysom, who will be known to a number of you, as our communications advisor. She's worked for a number of the local authorities in the partnership in previous roles. Natalie will be coming to you in your September meeting with a communications and engagement strategy and work program that flows off that. But she starts in earnest next week. That's one thing to highlight. In terms of the update from the Transport Working Group, I mentioned our funding application for vehicle VKT reduction funding from the Minister of Transport's Climate Emissions Reduction Fund. We are told that we're going to be getting good news in the next couple of weeks. That's the smoke signals, but I haven't seen the letter yet. Unfortunately, like all good things, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The money comes with tags, which is that it is spent in the next 6 months. So I have to spend it by Christmas. So we're going to have to hit the ground running very hard with that. The funding wasn't to actually do concrete things. It was to do planning work for how we would achieve vehicle kilometre reductions and to do some communications work about what our future transport network will look like and things like that. So the team are about to have to gear up and run very fast to respond to that funding opportunity. And I think at our last committee, you challenged me to improve the quality of our reports and particularly to start bringing in some metrics and data. I have commissioned a piece of work to start mapping to identify some KPIs and measures that relate to our key strategic moves in the strategy, our current set of key strategic moves. So that work commences in the next couple of weeks. And I'd hope to bring back to you some draft report cards. But in the meantime, as a teaser for what was in my head, we've got Axel speaking next from the Waikato Housing Initiative on the kinds of housing data and indicators that might speak to some of those key moves. So at least you get a sense of the kind of reporting I'm hoping to be able to produce for you in the future. I think that's really enough from me in terms of updates on what's in the paper.
Okay, thanks, Robert. And just before I open it for questions, just noting, which is helpful in terms on page 27, as part of his reporting, Robert's just outlined potential conflicts. It's a small nation, so it's just clarifying in terms of other work that he's involved with in this area. Okay.
First.
Oh, yes.
Could be.
Angela, then Mayor Jackie.
Thank you. Yeah, I've just got two questions. One is in response to the smart growth resolutions. Thank you, Bill, for putting those forward on the other side of the Kaimais. Just wondering, as a group, what our response or a note to self for you moving forward could be in order to further those conversations, especially important with all things State Highway 29, the rail corridor, over to, completing the Golden Triangle.
I think what would be, responding to that, probably what would be helpful, I'm just thinking on the fly here in terms of adding a second recommendation to Robert's report, really essentially the future-proof partnership supporting further discussions in terms of those matters that are outlined.
Okay, thank you. I've just got one more
Yes.
question. In regards to the delay in the delivery of the HPA, just wondering what the implications are for that delay, and yeah, unintended consequences of that.
Right. So, the HBA informs the FDS, Future Development Strategy, so that's the housing and building land capacity assessments, and is intended to drive into council LTPs. So it should inform your 30-year infrastructure strategies for the local authorities that have to prepare those. The delay does create some complications. We'll be running in parallel with council long-term plan processes, but it's not insurmountable in terms of the assumptions and the data will feed into those long-term plan processes, and we'll just have to manage that. There are no legal repercussions for failing to meet your FDS timeline that we've been able to identify to date anyway. And yeah, that's where we're at effectively. There seem to be no repercussions to us in terms of somebody slapping us over that wrist or lines or anything like that.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that answer. I'm just thinking more in terms of private plan changes that are possibly out there.
So private plan changes will be assessed under the current strategy and the current regional policy statement until we complete our FDS, and then that would have to flow through into the RPS. So the out of sequence development policy in the regional policy statement would apply in the meantime.
Cool, thank you.
I'm trying to do two things here at the moment, but Mayor Jackie.
Well, you're half X, Y, so I think you can manage that.
Over to you.
So it's all about the money for a start. Two things. So the VKT fund, $1 million for the future-proof area. Is there a split / criteria? So just really an action for later. I don't need a.
I can,
conversation.
it's a fund for a range of projects we
Yeah.
put up. So I can give you a list of the costs. I don't have it on the top of my head, but we can provide you the detail of what we sought funding for. My recollection, rough recollection is, because I can't resist giving you more information, is about 600K was for optimization planning work, which was around Hamilton City, and for the communications package, the how do we start doing better visual storytelling. I think there was about 200 odd K for the North Waikato study. It was 200K, I think, but I'll confirm the details. They're not small pieces of money for us to get on and do
No,
things
I
with.
saw the 1 million. So the other thing I guess it's really a bit of a general question. The UNISA, the Upper North Island Strategic Alliance, which is quite important, I think, is that we're one of the most driven through districts, but we're not part of it. So I'd like to understand how you help us to get to be involved in that committee and alliance.
Question. So the
It seems a
current,
bit strange that we're not.
yeah, the current membership of the Upper North Island Strategic Alliance is
Is it an old
Hamilton,
boys' school?
Hamilton, Tauranga, Hamilton, Tauranga, Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Northland, Whangarei,
Not us.
Waikato region.
Oh,
It's the 3 regional councils and the 3 urban metro. So
now Alan was a nice guy, and I'm sure Mia Harris was before. So how come it's all around us but not us?
I pass
So
on that.
how do we progress that? And who does that? And when?
Good question. I'm not
Blair,
involved. I'm
you-
not involved in it either. I think I'm looking around. Blair's the one official that works with it.
Yeah.
Mayor Jackie, there hasn't been a meeting of the NISA governors this triennium, to my knowledge. There is going to be one soon. That topic was the subject of a request from Mayor Allen. He wrote to that group and they considered it, and I think there was, I'm trying to remember now, there was some response, but certainly that can be put back to the next meeting as a request. There was some sympathy, but I think there was also, they were trying to find a middle ground. So
So it's not a public excluded meeting. So we can just arrive and come and listen.
look,
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I guess
I
I'm
understand the.
making a point.
Yeah.
Writing's one thing. I'm making the point. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments or questions in terms of the report? If there are not, have added in a further recommendation in the red, which takes out wording from Robert's report to provide the basis for that recommendation. And I've put on the word potential because it's, this is a work in progress and we've got to actually start having some discussions first and see where they may or may not lead.
Oh.
Good.
Chair, sorry, I do have
Sarah.
one question actually. Just for Robert, I was wondering, I understand that there's work happening on a 3-year work program in terms of implementation. What do you see as potentially being some of the key moves over the next year or so. Things for us to keep in mind.
Question. So obviously we have a work program to complete the future development strategy, which is where most of my resources are dedicated for the next 6 to 8 months. What we've got, there's an interesting, we've got the 7 strategic moves that are in the strategy, which I'm currently building that work program around. I think there's a good question to ask as to whether in this triennium, those are still the key strategic moves for Future Proof. And if we want to change those, it would be good to change those through the future development strategy review of the strategy. So I think it wasn't on my thinking of the work program until earlier today when it occurred to me that the moves were a bit out of date. I think we've got to look at, in terms of what the issues being raised by the future development strategy, are going to be access to industrial land across the sub-region. We've got the integration of land use and transport in the corridor across State Highway 29, so the Matamata, Tauranga, Hamilton connections, and likewise the Auckland connectivity through into between North Waikato and South Auckland. So those are the 3 things I've been thinking I would be focusing on. And then the 4th bit really is how do we give effect to our strategic transformational moves in terms of bringing the river to the center of all our planning. So we've committed and talked a lot about blue-green corridors in our strategy. We haven't really done a lot of work around what blue-green corridors mean for the sub-region. I think there's some thinking to be done there. And then obviously getting on and doing things like implementing the transport program business case. That's kind of our biggest strategic priorities. How we wrap that up in the program is still evolving.
Thank you.
Any further comments or questions? I'm just wondering, in terms though of that second recommendation, after the word partnership, whether we put in the wording, the local government and tangata whenua partners, close brackets, because there are ministers in the Crown who are part of membership of this, and we are not suggesting that they necessarily agree, because they could well be some of the people we'll be engaging with at a later date. So and we've done that previously, I think, when we've made submissions on government initiatives where we've sort of ring-fenced the local government and tangata whenua partners. And Richard's nodding to that suggestion. And tangata whenua. T-A-N-G.
Yeah, through the chair. Tangata whenua / mana whenua.
G-A-T-A. T-A-N-G-A-T-A. Yep, sorry. Yep. G-A-T-A / did you say mana whenua? Yeah, and then / mana whenua. Close partners, if you can just add in partners after there. Yep. 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 That just makes that that clear. Okay, if there's no further yes, I better get a move. Angela, seconded by Mayor Adrian. There's nothing further. We'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So we'll go on to the final item and report on the agenda, and that's item 8, commencing on page 28, regarding the Waikato Housing Initiative. report, and I'd like to Axel's already there. Welcome, Axel.
Thank you.
A different position probably to when you were last around this table.
That's right.
And certainly thanks for the work in terms of your current role. So we've got the report and information. So really handing over to you to highlight particular matters and any background that you'd like to provide to the committee.
Indeed. Yep. Well, thank you. And this is, I guess, part one of two reports to come. So the first report is one that seeks to look backwards, I guess, and just to get us up to speed with where we are. And the second one later in the year will be, in essence, I guess, the more interesting one, because that's the one that looks forward and helps to capture some of the directions of travel, the interventions, the initiatives that we might have underway. But it's difficult to decide, on that strategy and get the collective wisdom together if we don't have a shared starting point in terms of knowledge and understanding. And I note, Chair Bill, that the last housing information that came in front of this group, some was the 2018 regional stocktake from the housing initiative. There was a market economics report in 2020 using data up to about 19, and then the HBA that was done, I think, in 21, but with sort of 20-ish data. And really, there's been not much sort of presented to this forum in the meanwhile. And yet the 4 years that have passed since then have not been the typical 4 years. We've had quite an extraordinary period, actually, of traditional consenting levels for about 1,000 dwellings in the sub-region, going to 3,600 per annum in 2022. So like a very large increase in the amount of dwellings being constructed in the sub-region. And then, of course, the softening of the market that we're seeing now. So the next period will not look the same either. So it's important to just update us as to where we are now to sort of build that foundation and moving forward. So I'm going to save the best for first, because that's how I run now. So the segue from Robert earlier was to say, how will we report in the future? What are the KPIs? How will we report back in a more meaningful way? Be data driven. Let the data drive the narrative. So I've put in on page 36 of my report there, I've just restated those future-proof strategy goals, which talks to expecting affordability to improve. So that's both in terms of purchase price and rentals. And secondly, the typology, the sizes and types of houses to be, increasing in their range or mix, so as to better meet market demand. So that's what we're trying to measure, and those are good measures. And at this point, I guess I want to acknowledge that the data I pulled together here is really just data from the partners, right? So there's no new original data presented other than the data that's very helpfully been provided by Waikato District, by Hamilton City, by Waipa, as well as Kainga Ora. Now, in doing so, I'm very conscious that Matamata Piako is not included currently, because this is an update, I guess, effectively from 19 to 23. But the next report, 23 forwards, of course, must also include Matamata Piako. So just acknowledging that right up front. But those teams that I've referenced there, really, that this is their report. This is certainly their data. So what does it tell us? Well, in terms of coming back to Robert and with some nice clear report cards or KPIs, it's a bit trickier than I thought. The data is a little bit messy in this area, and we're dealing with census data from 18. We're dealing with statistics data that's sometimes from census, sometimes more recently derived from other places. Income data is all over the show. And even within councils themselves or different consenting authorities, some questions you can get answered to very quickly and very easily. How many townhouses compared to how many standalone dwellings? That's an easy one to answer. How many two-bedroom units is a harder one to answer. Not every council records it. Not every council records it in the same way. It'll be there somewhere, but it becomes then a manual process of looking at other documents or DCs or something else. So I guess in addressing the KPI side of it, I've got a suggestion at the end, which I'll finish on, and that's when I hope that the other partners who've contributed to this report will perhaps pipe in with their views. But it is important. It is important we get the data right, and I think this report hopefully illustrates that. It illustrates that in going through that that traditional 1,000 dwellings a year being built, actually no affordable housing of scale got built. Didn't happen. It didn't spontaneously occur. It is pleasing to see that in the last period, Kāinga Ora with public and social housing have really risen in prominence and are now somewhere between 6 and 8% of what's being built in Hamilton, 3.8% across the region. Welcome. And as we see, though, the MSD waiting lists are growing quicker than that. So there's a challenge ahead, but Kāinga Ora look like they're up to the task of meeting it. So that's really positive. The rest of the market, of course, gets delivered by developers. And in that previous time, as I said, affordable housing did not get delivered. In the boom time, these last 3 or 4 years, as the data now shows us here too, spoiler alert, no affordable housing got delivered at scale either. Now that we're coming into a softening period, I guess my conclusion must be that it's not going to spontaneously arrive by itself either. So that the interventions we're looking at, KPIs that we've got to assess progress, are right and are on the money. It's this is an important community issue that councils are rightly addressing. So I commend the councils on the work that they are doing, and I've listed some of those in the conclusion. Page 36, looking at what they can do within their the policy and regulation part, if you like, as well as land. So I won't dwell on that discussion, but certainly invite others to make comment here. I have specifically talked about inclusionary zoning, which is, I think, an important tool, and we are hoping, we are delivering a chapter to be a common starting point across the region, should that wish to be adopted. And Robert, I note also in regards to the HBA, there is an opportunity to make sure that we do pick up more nuanced and the most recent data if we can through that. So I hope to see not too much references to medium household income based on the 18 census, for example, is a good example, but rather something that's much more current. But yes, I would suggest also, and my challenge here, I guess, is that we start to collect more nuanced data right at source. So the councils themselves, who are looking at this as the output, they are responsible effectively for the input. So getting that brains trust together, that's probably already perhaps the one that's in place under Mark Davey, that's already looking at, from a sub-regional perspective, some of these measures. Maybe just having a discussion about, are there additional measures that focus more on typology and affordability that we can capture right at source in a way that's then easily extracted to report back to this forum and more widely, democratizing that data, I suppose. That will be a key outcome. The only other thing I'll flag just on the way through is I found it difficult to actually reach a firm conclusion around affordability. And there's a piece of work coming up for the WHI and leading that discussion regionally. And it's both in terms of the rental market, actually, but also in terms of purchase price. So really interesting contamination, and Mark Rawson and I were talking about this earlier. When you look at medium household income in Hamilton, for example, being about 112,000, I think it is, per annum in current Infometrics data, we do know, though, that the average medium household income for a homeowner might actually be materially different to that of a renting family. And yet we use the same number when we're looking at those multipliers. So that probably distorts it for both. It probably understates for one group and overstates for the other. I'm not quite sure how to attack that. But then if we zoom out regionally, that's not just on a whānau basis, but, the average income from someone in Matamata versus someone in Tuakau versus someone in Cambridge versus someone in Hamilton City. I mean, there are large differences within the sub-region, and you can't just sort of pump out a single number and say that's our number. We need to be a bit more nuanced about that, and I'm not quite sure where that data comes from in a way that we can put our hand on our heart and say that's it. But that's a second piece of work that WHI hopes to lead through this, in fact, in time for the second report to come back to this forum. And so in closing, I'll say for rental information, that's particularly concerning because our last HBA suggested that the system is under a little bit of pressure, but doing okay. I think the most recent report from Hamilton had a similar-ish conclusion, and yet the lived experiences and Kaingaora and MSD will tell us actually it's a crisis. So somewhere we're relying on different assumptions or different models or different data sets, and it's really important we try and cut through that to get a sort of one source of truth so that this forum can make informed decisions based on sound information. So there's a lot of information in the report. I'll take the rest as read, but happy to speak to anything. And I really invite the Kaingaora and the partner councils who provided the data to this to speak to any element they.
Okay, thanks, Axel. So I'll open it up for questions, comments. Sarah.
Thank you, Axel. I'm just wondering, in terms of Papakainga, what work has the housing initiative done around Papakainga, and where do you see that fitting into the model?
Papakainga is quite a useful model because for those councils that have already got Papakainga provisions in their district plans, they tend to be significantly more permissive than other forms of sets of rules around dwellings. Waikato district in particular, of course, I'm familiar with the new provisions there, and I know that's been a useful model for some others. So what we're doing, I guess, is working with each of the partner councils throughout actually all of the Waikato region, along with the sub-region, to pick out the best in class examples of rules that are enabling, and Papakainga rules are one of those. Also, there's additional funding that can get unlocked for infrastructure, for example, through Te Puni Kokori, which is specifically useful for de-risking the capital side of what might otherwise be at DC or something on council's books. That's very useful. And also some Māori freehold land, not so much settlement derived, but with hapu or family, are starting to think more widely about license to occupy models, almost, if you like, where some of the land might be set aside for whānau that whakapapa to that land, but there might also be 2 or 3 or 4 sections for others, but on a license to occupy basis, so that the ownership of the underlying ownership of the land, of course, can never change. It remains with that whānau, but there might be some income, or they might be reaching out to their slightly wider community to be part of solving this housing crisis that we're in. So yeah, it's an important part of Papakainga.
Thank you, Axel. And sorry, just on around the Papakainga issue, it was also in terms of future-proof and the future development strategy or any other work that we do, how does it fit in more broadly with that? That might be to you, Robert.
There we go. So to be honest, I'm not 100% sure what more we can say around Papakainga in the strategy. We already have some policy direction sitting in there. I'd need to go back to the detail. But the FDS, if we wanted to say more than what we currently say, the FDS could do so. It could also potentially, the strategy could be changed to be stronger about inclusionary zoning as well, if we wanted to go there, which is another point Axel raises.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave some others to ask questions. I might have one other.
Okay, I've got Mayor Adrian, then Nanaya.
Chair, I'm really interested in trying to unpick what affordable housing really is, because we're in this huge dilemma. Our land is expensive. It's expensive to build a home, and if you build a cheap house, are you effectively becoming the standards, and of course the cost, with double glazing, insulation, that's all added costs to buildings. So have you got any data from other regions as how they are achieving affordable housing? Like, is it such a thing? I'm really challenged by it, and that's why I have to ask the question. Any ideas, Axel? And thank you for including us in the next one. And Papakoing is definitely future, but there'll be challenges there around the costs for them to build as well, because a lot of them will be in rural settings, so they'll be required to have their own infrastructure as well. Yeah, but anyway,
Yep.
curious to know.
Sure, I'm happy to give some reflections because to be fair, there's more than one question in there, isn't there? So we as you know, we have some time coming up to get you up to speed. But we've actually got a list of about 24 actions that have come out that directly address under sort of six main headings. What we see are the actions or the levers that are most directly applicable to councils that will enable. As council is in a unique position to enable housing right across the whole spectrum, whether it's Kāinga Ora as a social housing provider, whether it's a habitat, whether it's a private developer doing, the whole retirement villages, doesn't matter. Council holds important bits of the puzzle for all of those. And within that, there are some very specific things to address. So coming to some of the things you've talked about, one of the inclusionary zoning, for example, is a really good example of a tool. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be the only thing. But just picking up on the conversation here and Robert's answer earlier, I think it would be useful if the strategy was stronger in its wording around housing and what is intended to do. And in fact, all the councils individually are working on actions and strategies right now in this space. So for the collective strategy to pick up on those bits that are aligned would be very relevant. But inclusionary zoning, for example, Adrian, is where you might be able to take the land out of the cost of a new build from a capital perspective and turn that into a leasehold component. So out of a sort of a $600,000-700,000 new build, that's probably half of it straight away. We are looking at things, building standards is probably something that's not on the quick to achieve list. I am aware that there was some work through CoLab done where councils tried to streamline consenting. I think that's a good idea. But there are other elements, for example, on the certification of materials. We are being held a little bit, well, I've got to be careful with my words. There is tight control around what can be specified in terms of materials in this country. And we saw that, for example, with the recent shortage of jib. We know that there's elephant board out of Thailand, there's magnesium board is widely used in Australia. There's the sort of foam boards with a cladding directly adhered to it at the factory is almost a kit set type build. Those products are simply not, they can't be specified in this country. And we are promoting a piece of work to suggest to government that maybe if something has a CE mark, it's in. If it meets some other standard we can agree is a good standard, why is there an additional obligation to prove to this market through brands that it's appropriate? So there's questions like that which will help, but they're not short-term fixes. That's for sure. I think there are low-hanging fruit. That's what that list of 24 actions are. There is a longer list of fruit that requires a taller ladder.
Nanaya.
Kia ora. Through the chair, I just wanted to get more clarity around licence to occupy on general title, having it been different to multiple owned land and the same process. How do you see that as being a process of licence to occupy as well?
Yeah, so everything, of course, has to come through whatever the ownership of that piece of land is, whether it's just an individual whānau or it could be owned by a trust or collectively owned in some other way. And depending on that, the first and often the longest, hardest step is to actually get agreement amongst all the owners about what's to happen with that piece of whenua, what that piece of whenua is to do for them. But I can give you a really interesting example from Rotorua, for example, where there's a retirement home now that's built on the lakeshore on a piece of Māori freehold land because whānau there decided that the key thing they wanted that piece of whenua to do for them was actually to generate employment. Not housing in this instance, not an income, but employment. So they enabled an independent developer to develop it into a retirement village. And in 50 years' time, I think it might even be shorter than that, the keys get handed to the owners and they can decide whether to pick up the operation from there or re-engage in another contract term. But in the meanwhile, the number of apprenticeships, permanent jobs, whether it's in the kitchens, whether it's in the gardens, whether it's apprenticeships, not apprenticeships, but professional support through caregivers, nurses. There's dozens and dozens of jobs that have been created out of that process. So that whenua has actually given rise to jobs in that instance.
So what would happen if we had to face land that's under ahu whenua, general title, that both have two titles on the one property?
I'm going to look around the room for someone who's smarter than me. I don't know what that situation is. I think titles have to be clear, ownership has to be clear, so that there's a clear direction from the owners.
The reason why I asked that, because we do have a lot of Māori land that do have two titles, general title and the Māori title. But we also got to remind ourselves that if there is two titles, Māori title supersedes general title.
Yeah. What I do know is we have an example in Raglan, for example, where the family has, I think it's about a 4-hectare block. There's a hectare or so they wish to retain for their own papakainga development for whānau that whakapapa to that land. But they're also conscious that within the Raglan community, there's a great shortage of rental accommodation and there's people in need of that. So they are looking at whether they can do some, might still be under papakainga provisions, but it's actually for someone to rent who doesn't necessarily whakapapa to that land, but they could never own it. They could never buy it or own it.
Just a bit concerned through the chair that license to occupy can be put together quite easily. But if you've got two titles on the property, it should be looked at in the Māori title first before general title.
Yep. And I think it's also fair that through Marae Tukuri, I've had a very clear message that at this time, Tainui, in terms of settlement-derived land, are not interested in that type of model. That's very much for the tribe's own benefit of the tribe's own members at this time. So I'm really talking about things that are more, whānau owned in a more general title sense. But yeah, good points. Yeah, kia ora.
Okay. Mark, did you want to add to anything? Just that you were, your organisation was referenced by Axel in his presentation? Okay.
I think if I can just say what Mark really wanted to say, but he's feeling a little bit shy. It is getting clarity around the data, particularly in the rental areas, is a looked to be quite a glaring gap in the way we looked at it, and that contamination, but particularly between what is actually genuine the income and therefore what can people afford if you're a renting family in Ngarawahia or in anywhere within the district is a key point where we've got weakness in the foundation upon which we are making decisions. So that's an area of concern that we need to address.
Yeah, Jackie.
Thank you through the chair. Oh, as usual, always a good report. Speaking to the mic. As usual, Axel, always a good report. One close to our hearts, since we sat together for a long time. and I'm just aware that we've got Kaingaora changing our 17 to 48 homes in Huntly West. And what comes up for mind over and over again is building houses versus building communities, the intergenerational, interministry, long-term support for embedding and ensuring that those families have the right support. And this is just a small scale one, so I guess it sounds like a big deal out of nothing. But when there's 200 Kaingaora homes in a subdivision of green space, which is quite potential, or 600 in some of my green spaces, then we start out now with a little crash dummy of 48 and go, how can we make this model work? Which segues back to our relation, which was my question to the ministers around how do we get that cross-ministry support and cohesion into future-proof for our building of communities? Because this is a prime example of, just building houses as opposed to communities. And, then segues into other conversations around limitation of infrastructure, not just waters and roading, but other ilk. So I know this is very close to our hearts. I just wonder, one, you've got a really good voice in the Waikato housing in this area. I know these things are close to your heart, so I'm telling you how to suck eggs a little bit. But, we want to really align on how we can use a model that's happening that has the potential to do a lot more housing, but in a way that's systemically a good outcome, particularly for the people going to those homes, but the existing communities. So just some frameworks around that, and also how we can support your initiative and vice versa around those long-term goals.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yes, you're right. And Waikato Housing Initiative, or the Regional Housing Initiative, has always talked about integrated affordability. And that level of, we started at that sort of 10%, and then we realised how far behind we were, and I'm now aiming for 20. But we're not talking about building, great big areas of entirely affordable housing. I think there is. I mean, that would be in some ways wonderful if everyone could access that and everyone would want to live there. But the reality is we need to integrate affordability so we have a complete community. Density is probably done better where it's close to existing amenity, where there is public transport access, where there are local supermarkets, access to school, walking distance to the basic things you need. And connections with with other whānau who are in that area, right? We don't want to build concentrations of any kind of housing that is distant from amenity and makes it unlivable, right? So we've always talked about integrated affordability. There are some that would suggest actually that integrated zoning, for example, the IZ, is best done left to the developer, but with obligations. So the requirement is on them when they master plan their development. That's also true for Kaingaora actually as a developer, that they integrate it into their overall development rather than someone else like council having to come in afterwards and say, right, you're going to put something over there or you're going to put it over there, and it may end up being less integrated, and maybe in the worst part of the development, or or in some other way less desirable. That's not what we want. That's not the society any of us want to live in. And there are a great many models, including that Nightingale model that Hamilton looked at and may come back somewhere else in the region that supports that. I'm aware of build to rent projects where actually there's a certain percentage of the units that have to be affordable, and that's defined, but not which units. So it could be different units at different times depending on which families move in and out. So it's, the tenure is completely blind to that, and there's no difference in the quality of the build or the product that's offered. I think that's the ultimate aim, to ensure connected communities, livable communities, and access to the services that we need. So yeah, very much the way. If councils feel strongly about that, let's see it in your instructions to Robert. That this isn't when we're reviewing the strategy. It's a priority that's being talked about by all councils, right, throughout the region. There's a number of housing strategies which are brand new. There are a number of resources that are new being created as part of this coming annual plan cycle and forming the LTPs. Well, if we are aligned on this, let's have it reflect in future-proof strategy.
Just as a segue to that is, so one scenario would be, so let's say Tuako, where we might have a green space which might take up to 800 homes, or 500, 400 lots, which could be 3x3 or duplexes as an example on green spaces. But two things. So Tuako is in the Auckland region for government departments, not the Waikato region. So how do we make sure that we're all talking on the same pages with the same, because our borders for the government departments go down to Mercer, right? Tuako's you? Okay, well, that's good.
Tuako's also us.
But well, because the segue of course goes back to a point that Adrian made at lunch was around Ministry of Education, but Ministry of Education, MSD at Elk, you're right, and even the policing. Well, we've got counties, Manukau Police, and then we've got Waikato Police. So don't get me started on the issues around affordable housing, entry housing, creating communities, and then we've got the rohi, of course, of Manawhenua and Tonga. But what I'm saying is, when at the moment in Hamilton, you've got 70% of infill brown, and brown house infill. But when you have a large lump of houses being built, what I don't see in the partnerships is, and with councils, we've got well-beings in our part of our legislation. I don't see the well-beings being partnered as we build with Kāinga Ora, like those other ministries on board at the same time in those development stages. If it is, great. Love to see those models, want to see those exemplars that we can copy and paste or take the best out of them. What I see is potentially plans for houses to be built, processes going on, and then finishing with the waters going in and walking away, maybe putting in, a community hall. Community hall does not go social well-being, nor the social interactions that form the network that creates those communities and their integration. Blah, blah, blah. So that's really the area I feel is missing and I'm concerned about. If there's exemplars where it's done, every time I've had a conversation, say it's with Love to Kāinga Ora, different people it's like we put a lot of work and time into underground infrastructure and to building really good homes. But the question had always been, how do you build strong communities with the number of houses? Because underground infrastructure does not make strong communities. It just makes good underground infrastructure. So I guess that's more of the page as well I'm on, is that, and sometimes that integration we've seen when we see growth of towns. Pocono is an example where it takes people a long time to bed in without any issues around affordability or, disenfranchisement from whether you were to where they have to settle, etc. Yeah. So I guess I'm more interested in those areas as well, not just people wanting to come in affordability. How do you, or have you been talking to ministries about that cohesion?
Yeah. Yes and no. I think when will police, health, education, Kāinga Ora, etc., all line up their boundaries? That I just checked. It's definitely not on my list. It's a big challenge. I don't know how to affect it, but you're right. It's real, and we see disjointed responses that are not helpful from a community perspective, and actually are perplexing sometimes from a community perspective. I think it's outside of what I can address, but I certainly, in terms of housing, and David piped in there as well, in terms of transport, in terms of Kāinga Ora and so on, there's a number of things that are within the Waikato region that match our rohe here as councils, and that's helpful. Evie thinks so too. On infrastructure itself, I would say that infrastructure is really the key enabler. It's all very well to have lands zoned correctly, but without infrastructure, it's not enabled, right? And that's really the key thing. So again, Robert will be very aware of that through the HBA, giving certainty to developers, be it Kāinga Ora, be it private developers who will deliver most of this, certainty of timing around infrastructure arriving to appropriately zone things is key. But then in terms of the other things you're picking up on, absolutely right. Wellbeings are back into local government legislation. They have been for a while. The new report from the panel earlier this week mentioned both affordable housing and social housing. Actually, I was quite interested to see, as part of the panel's view on what the future council functions might look like. What does that mean? We need to unpack a little bit what the panel's intentions are. But I think there is no doubt that that housing is recognised as a key area of a key area where councils can enable and facilitate. I'm not suggesting they become the developers or the builders, but they can enable and facilitate, and in doing so will have that community, that whole community well-being in mind, more so perhaps than any particular one developer who may be more or less benign.
Okay, final question, Mayor Susan,
Yeah, look-
and I just, please, as a committee member, do not leave the room because we'll be in court. So, so we're getting close to the bewitching hour. So,
Yeah, look, through you, Bill. Look, mindful of the time, obviously, and it's not a question. It's just kind of interesting. It sort of elaborates a little bit on Adrian's point around affordability. For me, it's just this huge conundrum and tension between a whole bunch of competing notions or rules or values in terms of the protection of highly productive soils on one hand, housing intensification legislation, push to build more houses, and then the third part of that is affordability. So it reminds me of that lemon awful saying, cheap, fast, and good. You can't have all three. You can only have two at a time. So if something's cheap and fast, it won't be good. If something's fast and good, it won't be cheap. Same thing. So you've got these three kind of notions that are really hard to gel together. And I guess the result, I mean, we said in Waipa, obviously, that the smaller the land plot gets, the higher the price goes. And, wrapped around that, you've got your highly productive soils. And it just, so as a result of that, you get your average price in Waipa now for a home is just on 900,000. So, it's, that obvious competition for me in my head, and I can't unravel it. And it probably goes to your big question of what is affordable.
Yeah.
Those are the notions underpinning it all, and they're all competing, and we've got to deliver them all.
Yeah,
And it's hard work. Don't have the answers.
No,
You're
and one bit of
small-brained.
comment.
Gab, we've got people like you on board who can help us. I sure as heck can't.
Thank you, and I've already made it slightly easier in my head, and I'm really trying not to sound flippant because that's not my intention. If those are the three competing tensions, I'm happy to give away fast. Just pause there for effect. So it's taken us 3 decades to get into this mess, right? It's taken 30, maybe 40 years almost, basically since the Longy Douglas government sold off Housing Corp and started that divestment, and the state didn't respond, and this is a government of either flavour, didn't respond by adding to more public housing stock, right? We've been 30, 40 years to get to where we are now. We're not going to get out of it fast. There isn't a fast solution. But because the answer is we want good and we want cheap, then the thing we have to sacrifice is probably just to recognise it's going to take us years to build our way back out of this if we want to do it in a way that's right and not end up with with negative outcomes in areas that are just not livable or have other issues, social issues attached with them.
Sarah.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Chair Bill, I was just wondering, you mentioned, or someone mentioned, if we want to have a focus around affordable housing and in the future development strategy, do we need to indicate that through any wording, or that's been a clear message already? Okay, excellent. Thank you.
I didn't hit my button. I've heard the message, and it is, I was just looking back over the strategy while Axel was talking, and there is a fair bit in the strategy about housing affordability. The question is how much detail we go into and how specific we get. So that's a challenge I'll put back to the team.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I've had a strong message from some of my colleagues that things like typology, whether it's 1, 2 bedroom or 5+, and those kinds of issues, along with the delivery of papakāinga and things, are important as well. So if there's any way we can reflect that, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay. Well, thank you, Axel. And I think in terms of the discussion we've had, really outlines the importance of the housing initiative being connected in and being part of the future-proof arrangements. For those who don't know around the table, Axel has joined the Chief Executive's Advisory Group for Future Proof. So in terms of that ongoing involvement and working together and that sharing around that table and the wider partnership, that helps anchor that. So thanks very much for that and responding to the range of questions. Thank you. Forward to seeing you at other times.
Part 2 will be even better.
Yes. Okay, we've got our recommendation in front of us. If I can have someone to move and second that. It's Mayor Susan, seconded Mayor Adrian. There's nothing further. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So, and just before I ask Nanaya in terms of our closing Karakia, a couple of things I want to talk about, mention. Lyndall will be circulating. She's on other duties at the moment. The Future Proof Implementation Committee agreement. So that will be going to all partners. You've approved that at the previous meeting, and it's just the final sign off on that. And Vishal, you've been doing some work in the political space. So if you can just
Not a politician, but I have been doing so. So just tēnā koutou katoa, just a bit of background. So Hamilton City Council and Waikato District Council have a government relationship meeting, a bilateral meeting every 2 months or so. And at the last meeting, it was deemed important for us to have conversations with political parties in the lead up to the elections, just to share some of the challenges and opportunities that may help with policy making, but also even post-elections to build a relationship with the government of the day to help us with addressing some of the challenges in the sub-region. And we decided to extend that to the other partners as well, Matamata Piako and also Waipa. So we've managed to secure, albeit just 30 minutes, with the Green Party, Julianne Genter, and we're looking at getting some time with the ACT Party, as Simon Coots has that he's willing to have a conversation. So we'll put a tentative date for that in your diaries. We're just working on together with Hannah Windle from Hamilton City Council, National Party and Labour Party as well. And as soon as we get some times for those, we will send those to you. There will be online sessions, and as you can understand, it's quite a busy period for the MPs at the moment. So we'll just see whatever we can get and put those in your diary. And the format of it will just be to give each council rep at least 5 or 10 minutes to just share some of the challenges and opportunities for their respective councils. There will be commonalities with others as well, so that's good. But I think to be fair, we'll just give each one a chance, or whoever's there, to share those the MPs concerned. Thank you, Chairperson.
Okay, no, thanks Vishal. So,
Can I just mention, was there consideration of the regional council within those discussions?
Yes, Chair Pamela, and I've also emailed it as well. So Angela, also here.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. So that concludes our meeting. So Nanaya, can you close for us, please? Okay. Thank you, everyone, and the meeting's closed.